The fog was thick that morning near Arracourt. September 19th, 1944. A German Panther tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, sat in his turret scanning the grey wall of mist ahead. Behind him, 14 more Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade idled their engines, waiting. They had pushed through the night, part of Hitler's last desperate counter-offensive in Lorraine, tasked with smashing through the American bridgehead and recapturing Lunéville. Reinhardt checked his watch. 0730 hours. Somewhere in that superhead lay the Americans. Intelligence reported light resistance. Sherman tanks, perhaps. Infantry. Nothing the Panther couldn't handle. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through a Sherman's front plate at 2,000 meters. The Panther's sloped armor, 80mm thick at the glacis, made it nearly invulnerable to American tank fire at range. The column began to move. Slowly at first, tracks churning mud. Visibility, maybe 50 meters. Reinhardt's gunner called out distances, listening to the radio for updates. The fog played tricks. Sounds bounced, echoed. A tree became a tank. A shadow became movement. Then, at 0745, everything changed. A sound, high-pitched, not the diesel growl of a Sherman, sharper, faster, like something lighter. Before Reinhardt could identify it, his loader shouted, "Contact! 2 o'clock! 300 meters!" Through a brief gap in the fog, Reinhardt saw it. Olive drab, low profile. An open-topped turret with a long barrel pointed directly at his flank. The silhouette was wrong. Too small, too angular. Not a Sherman. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American gunner fired first. The flash lit up the morning. The 76mm armor-piercing round crossed 300 meters in less than time, half a second. It struck the Panther's side armor at a 30-degree angle, punching through the 40mm plate and detonating inside the fighting compartment. Reinhardt never heard the explosion. His Panther lurched, smoke pouring from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, stumbling into the fog. Behind him, the second Panther tried to traverse its turret. The hydraulic system whined. The massive gun began to swing. But turret traverse on a Panther, even the improved WWII model, took time. At high engine RPM, a full 360-degree rotation required 18 seconds. At combat idle, it could take 60. The American machine wasn't waiting. By the time the German gunner had the turret halfway around, the American vehicle had already moved. Not slowly, not cautiously. It accelerated. Through the fog, witnesses later reported, the machine tore across the field at a speed that seemed impossible for tracked armor. 50 miles per hour, maybe more. It repositioned 200 meters to the left, stopped, fired, and was gone before the Panther's barrel could complete its traverse. Another hit, another Panther burning. What the Germans were facing that morning wasn't a tank. It was the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked armoured fighting vehicle in the world. And for the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, the mathematics of speed were about to become a lesson in survival they would never forget. This is a story about 40 seconds. 40 seconds that separated life from death. 40 seconds between the moment a Hellcat was spotted at 2 miles and the moment it closed to killing range moving at 55 miles per hour. 40 seconds during which German tank commanders, trained to fight battles of armor and attrition, suddenly found themselves prey to something they had not anticipated. American engineering designed not to overpower, but to outmaneuver. Let us rewind to understand how this moment came to be. In December of 1941, the United States Army faced a problem. The German blitzkrieg had devoured Poland, France, and vast swaths of the Soviet Union using massed armor tactics. American doctrine, still rooted in the trench warfare of World War I, had no answer to fast-moving panzer columns that could punch through defensive lines and encircle entire armies before they could react. General George Marshall tasked his planners with developing a specialized anti-tank force, not heavy tanks to slug it out head-to-head with German armor. That was not the American way. Instead, They envisioned fast, mobile tank destroyers that could race to threatened sectors, ambush enemy armor, and withdraw before the panzers could respond. Speed over armor, mobility over protection. The philosophy was radical. It was also desperate. The first attempts failed. The M3 gun motor carriage, a 75mm gun mounted on a half-track, was laughably inadequate in North Africa. German 88mm guns destroyed them at ranges where the American guns couldn't even aim properly. The M10 Wolverine, built on a Sherman chassis, was better. It had a 3-inch gun and respectable armor, but it was too slow. Top speed 30 miles per hour on roads. Off-road, barely 20. Against Panthers and Tigers that could engage from 2 kilometers away, the M10 arrived at battles too late or died trying. The Tank Destroyer Command, led by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, wanted something different. Bruce was a visionary. He understood that in modern warfare, the first shot often decides the engagement. To get that first shot, you needed to be where the enemy wasn't expecting you. To survive after taking it, you needed to be gone before they could reply. That required one thing above all: speed. In April of 1942, the Army issued specifications that seemed impossible. They wanted a tank destroyer that could reach 50 miles per hour. It had to weigh less than 20 tons to achieve that speed, yet mount a gun powerful enough to kill German armor. The armor could be thin, almost non-existent, because the vehicle's defense would be its mobility. Survival through motion, not through the thickness of steel. Most manufacturers walked away. The specifications contradicted everything they knew about armored vehicle design. But Buick Motor Division, a company that built luxury automobiles, saw an opportunity. Their chief engineer understood car design. He understood weight distribution, power-to-weight ratios, and aerodynamics. He approached the problem not as a tank designer, but as someone building a very fast, very angry car that happened to carry a cannon. The result was the T-70 prototype. It used the Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, the same power plant in the Sherman tank, producing 400 horsepower. But unlike the Sherman, which weighed 33 tons, the T-70 weighed only 19. That gave it a power-to-weight ratio of 21 horsepower per ton, twice that of any German tank in service. The suspension used torsion bars, not the vertical volute springs of the Sherman. This kept the hull low and improved handling at high speeds. The transmission was revolutionary, a Torque-matic automatic that allowed the driver to shift gears without taking hands off the controls. In tests at the proving grounds in Michigan, the T-70 hit 60 miles per hour on paved roads. On rough terrain, it maintained 45. Engineers watching the trials couldn't believe what they were seeing. Steel wasn't supposed to move that fast, but speed came at a cost. The armor on the front hull was only 13 millimeters thick. The turret, cast from a single piece, was 25 millimeters at its thickest point. For reference, a German Panther had 80 millimeters of frontal armor, a Tiger 100. American ordnance tests revealed a sobering truth. 30 caliber armor-piercing bullets, fired from a standard rifle, could penetrate the Hellcat's turret at 75 yards. 9 out of 30 rounds tested went clean through. The open-topped turret made things worse. Designed to save weight and improve crew visibility, it left the 5-man crew exposed to artillery fragments, grenades, and snipers. In winter, crews froze. In combat, they were vulnerable to anything that exploded nearby. One officer, reviewing the prototype, called it a suicide machine. "You're giving our boys a coffin on treads," he said. But another engineer, younger and less concerned with tradition, smiled. "Maybe," he replied, "but it's the fastest coffin in Europe." The Army approved the design in February of 1943. Production began in July at Buick's plant in Flint, Michigan. The assembly line, repurposed from building Roadmaster sedans, now churned out tank destroyers at a rate of 250 per month. Workers, many of them women who had never seen a military vehicle, learned to mount engines, weld turrets, and install the 76mm M1A1 gun with precision that would have impressed any armaments factory. The gun itself was a compromise. It wasn't the 90mm cannon that some commanders wanted. It didn't have the penetrating power to defeat a Tiger's frontal armor at long range. Against a Panther, even with the best armor-piercing ammunition, it struggled beyond 500 meters when shooting at the front. But the 76mm had advantages. It was light, it reloaded quickly, and it could punch through the side or rear armor of any German tank in existence. This was the key to the Hellcats' design philosophy. It wasn't built to fight fair, it was built to flank, to ambush, to fire from positions the enemy couldn't reach in time. The doctrine was simple and brutal. Find the enemy, kill the enemy, leave before the enemy knows what happened. Crews would later call it shoot and scoot. If you fired twice from the same position, you were dead. By June of 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, the first Hellcat battalions arrived in France. The 704th, 705th, and 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalions, all equipped with the M18. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, was skeptical. He had read the reports. 13mm of armor, open turret, a gun that couldn't reliably kill a Tiger from the front. He requested more M10s, heavier and more proven. But General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, thought differently. Patton understood speed. His entire philosophy of warfare revolved around aggressive maneuver, rapid exploitation, and keeping the enemy off balance. When he saw the Hellcats' specifications, he reportedly smiled. "This," he said, "is how you kill panzers. Not by being tougher, by being faster." The Hellcats' first major test came not in the hedgerows of Normandy, but in the rolling hills of Lorraine. By September of 1944, Patton's Third Army had advanced eastward across France at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies. His armoured spearheads crossed the Moselle River and threatened the German border itself. Hitler, desperate to halt the American advance, ordered a counteroffensive. 2 Panzer Corps, over 200 tanks, would smash through Patton's extended lines and recapture the critical towns of Lunéville and Arracourt. The German plan relied on their superiority in armour. They fielded Panthers, the most advanced medium tank in the world. With its long-barreled 75mm gun and sloped armour, the Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank couldn't even penetrate its hide. Intelligence estimated the Americans had only light forces in the sector, Shermans, infantry, perhaps some towed anti-tank guns, nothing that could stand against a concentrated panzer assault. They were wrong. On the morning of September 19th, as fog blanketed the fields outside Arracourt, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade moved forward. Their objective: eliminate American positions and push toward the town. They expected resistance. What they got was a massacre. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, commanding an M18 platoon from Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, had positioned his 4 vehicles in a slight depression outside the village of Réchicourt-la-Petite. Visibility was poor, maybe 30 meters. The Hellcats idled quietly, their crews watching the fog for movement. Leiper's gunner, peering through the telescopic sight, suddenly hissed. Contact. Dead ahead. Through the mist, the long barrel of a German tank appeared. 30 feet away, close enough to see the muzzle brake, close enough to count rivets. A Panther. Leiper's heart hammered. At this range, the Panther's 88mm gun could obliterate his Hellcat with a single shot. But the German crew hadn't seen him yet. The turret was pointed the wrong direction. Leiper barked the command. Fire! The Hellcat's 76mm gun cracked. The recoil rocked the vehicle. The armor-piercing round, travelling at 2,700 feet per second, covered 30 feet in 1/100th of a second. It struck the Panther's side, just below the turret ring, and detonated. The German tank erupted in flame. Before the echo faded, Leiper's driver threw the Hellcat into gear. The engine screamed. Tracks bit mud. The vehicle leapt forward, repositioning 50 meters to the left. Through the fog, another Panther appeared, turret slowly traversing toward where Leiper had been moments before. Too slow. Leiper's gunner had already acquired the target. Another shot. Another kill. 5 minutes. 5 German tanks destroyed. 1 Hellcat lost when a Panther, by sheer luck, fired blind into the fog and hit. But Leiper's platoon held position. Over the next hour, 10 more Panthers pushed through the mist. 10 more were all destroyed. The Germans, confused and demoralized, couldn't understand what they were facing. Their tanks, designed to dominate battlefields, were being picked apart by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, couldn't kill. 1 Hellcat, commanded by Sergeant Henry R. Hauptmann, accounted for 6 Panthers by itself. Hauptmann's tactic was simple. Fire. Move 200 meters, fire again, never stay still, never give the enemy a stationary target. The Panther crews, trained to fight set-piece battles at long range, had no answer. By the time they traversed their turrets, Hauptmann was gone. By the time they repositioned their hulls, he had fired from a new location. The arithmetic was brutal. A Panther's turret, even at maximum engine RPM, took 18 seconds for a full rotation. Half that, 9 seconds, to swing 90 degrees. In 9 seconds, a Hellcat moving at 55 miles per hour covered 700 feet, more than 2 football fields. By the time the German gunner had his sights where the Hellcat had been, the American destroyer was already somewhere else, gun pointed, ready to fire. By midday, the fog lifted. American artillery observers, finally able to see the battlefield, directed fire onto the stalled German columns. XIEC, Tactical Air Command, Patton's air support, arrived in force. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down, rockets and bombs tearing into Panthers that sat exposed, their commanders unable to advance or retreat. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had begun the morning with 45 tanks, ended the day with 18. 27 were destroyed, most by Hellcats. German after-action reports, captured weeks later, revealed the confusion. One company commander wrote, "The American light tanks move at speeds we cannot match. They appear from nowhere, fire, and vanish. Our crews report turret traverse insufficient to engage, request immediate tactical guidance. There was no guidance to give. The Germans had built their armor doctrine around the concept of frontal engagement. Thick armor, powerful guns, stand and fight, dominate through superior firepower. The Hellcat inverted that doctrine. It didn't fight fair. It didn't stand still. It exploited the one advantage the Germans couldn't overcome: time. Consider the mathematics that terrified German tank crews. A Hellcat, detected at 2 miles, travelling at 55 miles per hour, closed that distance in 2 minutes and 10 seconds, 130 seconds. But the Hellcat didn't need 2 miles. Its effective engagement range against a Panther's side armour was 1,000 metres, just over half a mile. At 55 miles per hour, it covered that distance in 40 seconds. 40 seconds. That was the window. The time between when a German tank commander spotted the Hellcat on the horizon and when that Hellcat was close enough to fire a killing shot. 40 seconds to identify the threat, alert the crew, traverse the turret, acquire the target, and fire. Against a stationary target, manageable. Against something moving 55 miles per hour, weaving, using terrain for cover, nearly impossible. Now consider the Panther's limitations. Its turret traverse, even optimized, took 18 seconds for a full rotation. If the Hellcat approached from the rear quarter, the German gunner needed to swing the turret perhaps 180 degrees, 9 seconds at best. But by the time the gunner identified the target, called it out, and began traversing, 3 to 5 seconds had already passed. That left 4 to 6 seconds to aim and fire at a target that was moving, closing fast, and about to disappear behind terrain. Most German gunners never got the shot off. Meanwhile, the Hellcat's 360-degree traversable turret could swing to face any threat in under 4 seconds. Its gunner, positioned with excellent visibility in the open-topped turret, could acquire targets faster than his German counterpart sitting in an enclosed vision-slit limited position. The Hellcat saw first, aimed first, fired first, and if it missed, it was gone before the Panther could reply. The psychological impact was devastating. German tank crews, accustomed to dominating battlefields with superior armor and firepower, suddenly found themselves hunted. Panthers that had shrugged off Sherman fire at 1,500 meters were dying to flank shots they never saw coming. Tigers, the most feared tanks in the European theatre, were bypassed entirely. The Hellcat didn't engage them frontally. It waited, circled, and struck from angles where even a Tiger's armor couldn't save it. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a Panther loader who survived Arracourt, later wrote in his diary, "We heard the engine before we saw it, high-pitched, like a racing car. Then it was there, 70 meters to our left. Our gunner tried to traverse, but it was too fast. We fired blind, missed. By the time we reloaded, it was gone. 2 minutes later, it killed the tank behind us. We never saw it again. The fear wasn't just tactical. It was existential. German crews began to understand that their technological superiority meant nothing if they couldn't bring it to bear. The Panther's thick armor was useless if the Hellcat shot from the side. The Tiger's 88mm gun was meaningless if it couldn't aim fast enough. Speed, they realized, had become a weapon, and the Americans had weaponized it beyond anything the Wehrmacht had imagined. By the time the Battle of Arracourt ended on September 29th, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had knocked out 39 German tanks. 4 Hellcats were destroyed, 3 damaged. The kill ratio, nearly 10-1, stunned Allied command. Even more shocking was the manner of the kills. Most German tanks were struck in the side or rear. Most had been attempting to reposition when they were hit. Almost none had managed to return fire effectively. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, reviewed the reports with disbelief. His staff insisted the Americans must have deployed a new heavy tank, something with armor and firepower that intelligence hadn't detected. When reconnaissance confirmed the vehicle was the M18, lightly armored and mounting only a 76mm gun, Manteuffel stared at the photographs in silence. Finally, he said, "We have been outthought." In Berlin, Wehrmacht High Command issued tactical bulletins to panzer units across all fronts. Subject: American M18 tank destroyer. The document, distributed in October of 1944, warned commanders about the vehicle's speed and recommended avoiding engagement unless in prepared defensive positions with infantry support. It concluded, direct frontal engagement inadvisable. Vehicles, mobility allows rapid repositioning. Crews report difficulty maintaining target acquisition. The bulletin was an admission of defeat without calling it that. The German army, masters of armoured warfare, innovators of the Blitzkrieg, had been outmaneuvered by a vehicle designed not in a military academy, but in a General Motors automotive division by engineers who normally designed sedans. The irony wasn't lost on German officers. They had pioneered the concept of fast, mobile armour in the 1930s. Lightning war, rapid breakthrough, exploitation through speed. Now, in 1944, the Americans had taken that philosophy, stripped away the unnecessary weight of ideology and over-engineering, and created something more effective, a machine designed for a single purpose, executed perfectly. But the story of the Hellcat isn't just about speed. It's about the men who crewed it, knowing full well that 13mm of armor couldn't stop anything heavier than a rifle bullet. These men climbed into vehicles that would disintegrate under a direct hit and raced toward Panthers and Tigers with calm professionalism. They understood the bargain. Speed for protection, mobility for survival. Hit first or die. The cold bit through Lieutenant Robert Carver's gloves as he gripped the rim of his Hellcat's turret. December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day. The Ardennes forest outside the Belgian town of Neuville was silent, except for the crunch of snow under tank treads and the distant rumble of artillery. Carver, 23 years old, from Ohio, commanded one of 4 M18 from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion assigned to support Team de Sobry. Team de Sobry was a scratch force. Elements of the 10th Armoured Division mixed with paratroopers from the 506th Regiment of the 101st Airborne. They had been rushed to Noville the night before, racing through darkness to establish a blocking position north of Bastogne. The mission was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Hold the road junction. Don't let the 2nd Panzer Division pass. Intelligence reported at least 30 German tanks approaching. Panthers, Panzer IVs, maybe Tigers. Against them, Team de Sobry had perhaps a dozen Shermans, 4 Hellcats, and 1,200 infantrymen dug into frozen ground. The math didn't favour the Americans. But Carver had learned something at Arracourt, at Lunéville, across every fog-soaked field in France. Math was only part of the equation. Speed changed calculations. At 06:15, the Germans came. They moved with confidence, a battalion-strength assault pushing down the main road toward Noville. Panzer IVs in the lead, Panthers following, infantry mounted on half-tracks. The column stretched for half a mile. Their objective, punch through Noville, seize Bastogne, and capture the fuel dumps that would allow the German offensive to continue. Without those dumps, the entire Ardennes counter-offensive would stall for lack of gasoline. Carver's Hellcat sat hull down behind a stone wall on the eastern edge of town. His gunner, Corporal Eddie Reeves from Georgia, watched through the telescopic sight as the German column drew closer. 800 meters, 700. Carver waited. The doctrine was clear. Let them close. Make every shot count. At 600 meters, Reeves whispered, "Request permission to fire." Carver watched the lead Panzer IV. Its turret was traversing left, scanning the western approach to town. The crew hadn't spotted the Hellcat yet. Good. At 550 meters, Carver gave the order. Fire. The 76mm gun barked. The Panzer IV shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The German column halted. Turrets began to swing, searching for the threat. Carver's driver, without waiting for orders, threw the Hellcat into reverse. The vehicle shot backward, disappeared behind a building, then accelerated forward on a parallel street. 30 seconds had elapsed. The Hellcat was now 200 meters south of its previous position. Reeves acquired a Panther, range 400 meters. Side shot. He fired. The round punched through the Panther's 40mm side armor and exploded inside. The German tank lurched to a stop, crew bailing out into the snow. 3 seconds later, Carver's Hellcat was moving again, this time north, using a grove of trees for cover. The other 3 Hellcats followed the same pattern. Fire. Move. Fire again. Never stay still. The Germans, attempting to suppress what they thought were stationary anti-tank positions, fired into empty streets. Their shells destroyed buildings, knocked down walls, set fires. But the Hellcats were never where the Germans expected. By 0700, the American destroyers had knocked out 7 German tanks. But the Germans kept coming. More Panthers, more Panzer IVs. They pushed past burning wrecks, infantry dismounting to clear buildings. The fight devolved into chaos, tank against tank at ranges so close that armor meant nothing. A Panther fired at 20 meters and missed as the Hellcat it targeted accelerated away at full speed. A Panzer IV rounded a corner and took a 76mm shell through its front plate before its gunner could even identify the target. At 0730, a Panther caught one of the Hellcats in the open. The German 75mm gun fired. The American destroyer exploded. The crew was killed instantly. But the other 3 Hellcats, informed by radio, converged on that Panther from 3 directions. It died in a crossfire, struck simultaneously by rounds that tore through its turret and hull. This was the Hellcat's true advantage in close combat. Not armor, not even speed, though speed helped. It was situational awareness. The open-topped turret, for all its vulnerabilities, gave American crews unmatched visibility. They could see threats coming. They could coordinate, by sight and radio, in ways that German crews, buttoned up inside their enclosed turrets, could not. Private James Holcomb, an infantryman with the 506th, watched the battle from a second-story window. Later, he would write home, The Hellcats didn't fight like tanks. They fought like wolves. You'd see one shoot, then vanish. A minute later, it reappeared somewhere else. The Germans couldn't figure out where they'd be next. Every time a Panther stopped to aim, a Hellcat hit it from the flank. It wasn't a fair fight. But then, war isn't supposed to be fair. By noon, the German assault had stalled, 14 tanks destroyed, another 6 were damaged. The 2nd Panzer Division's commander, desperate to maintain momentum, ordered a withdrawal to regroup. Team de Sobry held Noville. The road to Bastogne remained blocked, and 4 Hellcats, 3 still operational, had accounted for more than half the German tank losses. But the cost was real. The destroyed Hellcat's crew was gone. The other 3 vehicles were low on ammunition. Carver counted his remaining rounds. 11 armor-piercing, 8 high explosives. Not enough for another major engagement. Fuel was also running low. The Hellcat, for all its speed, consumed gasoline at a terrifying rate. 25 litres per 100 kilometres off-road. At full combat speed, even worse. That afternoon, as medics treated wounded and engineers cleared wrecks from streets, Carver sat with the other Hellcat commanders. They were exhausted. Filthy. One had taken shrapnel to the shoulder but refused evacuation. They compared notes, shared lessons. One commander observed, "The Panthers tried to use their range advantage. Didn't work. We were inside their decision cycle before they could react. Inside their decision cycle." The phrase, borrowed from fighter pilot doctrine, captured the Hellcat's tactical essence. The Germans operated on a timeline: spot threat, identify, traverse turret, aim, fire. That sequence took time, 10 seconds minimum, often 15 or 20. The Hellcat compressed that timeline. Its speed, its visibility, its faster turret traverse all combined to complete the kill chain faster than the enemy could respond. Colonel James O'Neill, who later studied the Hellcat's performance in detail, wrote, "The M18 didn't win by being tougher. It won by operating at a tempo the Germans couldn't match. In combat, speed isn't just movement. It's decision-making." The Hellcat crews saw faster, decided faster, acted faster. By the time the German crew completed their sequence, the Hellcat had already executed 2 cycles. That's not an equipment advantage. That's a conceptual revolution. The Germans, reviewing their losses after the Battle of the Bulge, struggled to develop countermeasures. Some panzer commanders recommended travelling in pairs, one tank providing overwatch, while the other moved. Others suggested infantry screens to spot the fast American destroyers before they closed to DOE, killing range. A few proposed avoiding engagement entirely, unless terrain prevented the Hellcat from exploiting its speed. None of these solutions proved effective. Paired tanks were still vulnerable to Hellcats attacking from multiple directions. Infantry screens were picked apart by American artillery and airstrikes before the armor even arrived. And avoiding engagement meant ceding initiative to an enemy who already controlled tempo. In January of 1945, a captured German tank commander, Hauptmann Fritz Schroeder, was interrogated by American intelligence. The transcript reveals the psychological impact the Hellcat had on Wehrmacht morale. Interrogator: "Your after-action reports mention difficulty engaging American M18 tank destroyers. Can you elaborate?" Schroeder: "The M18 is not a tank. It is a nightmare. You hear it before you see it. That engine sound, higher pitched than our diesels. Then it appears, moving faster than anything with tracks should move. By the time we traverse to engage, it is already firing. By the time we fire back, it is gone." Interrogator: "What tactics did your unit employ against it?" Schroeder: "We tried everything. Ambush positions, pre-registered fire zones. Nothing worked consistently. The American crews are trained differently than ours. They do not seek to hold ground. They seek to kill and leave. It is impossible to defend against an enemy who does not wish to occupy territory, only to destroy your ability to fight." Interrogator: "Did this affect morale?" Schroeder: Long pause. "My crews began to fear the sound of that engine. When we heard it, We knew someone would die. Usually us. That is not a tactical assessment. That is terror. The interrogator's notes, preserved in National Archives, add a final observation. Subject appeared shaken when discussing the M18, displayed symptoms consistent with combat stress, recommended further psychological evaluation. This was the hidden cost of the Hellcat's speed. It didn't just destroy tanks. It destroyed confidence. German crews, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced T-34s and KVs and survived, now hesitated when they heard that distinctive engine note. Hesitation, in armoured combat, was fatal. But the Hellcat was not invincible. Its thin armour meant that any hit was likely catastrophic. The open turret exposed crews to artillery and mortar fire. In winter, crews suffered from exposure. In summer, the heat inside the fighting compartment was brutal. Mechanical reliability, while good by American standards, still meant breakdowns. A Hellcat immobilized by a thrown track or engine failure was a sitting target. The statistics tell part of the story. Of the 2,507 Hellcats produced during the war, approximately 236 were lost to enemy action in Europe. Another 150 were lost to mechanical failure, accidents, or other non-combat causes. The overall loss rate, roughly 15%, was actually lower than the Shermans' 22%. But those numbers mask the reality that when a Hellcat was hit, its crew rarely survived. Sergeant Michael Torres, a loader in the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, survived 3 different Hellcats being destroyed under him. The third time, he was the only survivor. In a 1998 interview, he reflected, "We all knew we were in a death trap. 13 millimeters of armor. That's half an inch. I've seen rifle bullets punch through at close range, but we also knew we had a chance. Speed gave us a chance. If we were in a Sherman, we'd have been dead 3 times over fighting Panthers head-on. The Hellcat let us fight on our terms. That's worth something." The doctrine of shoot and scoot became so ingrained in Hellcat crews that it influenced post-war American armor development. The concept of highly mobile, lightly armored fighting vehicles designed for rapid strike missions would later evolve into, say, air cavalry doctrine in Vietnam, and eventually into the modern cavalry scout platoons using vehicles like the M3 Bradley. The Hellcat's philosophical legacy, speed as survival, remained relevant decades after the war ended. By February of 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the Hellcat battalions found fewer targets. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, were shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages meant German tanks often sat abandoned by roadsides, out of gasoline. Those that did fight were frequently crewed by inexperienced personnel, boys of 16 and 17, old men recalled from retirement. Against such opponents, the Hellcat's advantages mattered less, but in isolated engagements, the Patton held. March 7, 1945, near the Remagen Bridge, a platoon of Hellcats from the 809th Tank Destroyer Battalion encountered 3 King Tigers, the most heavily armoured tanks ever produced. Frontally, the King Tiger was invulnerable to the 76mm gun, 180mm of sloped armour. Nothing the Hellcat carried could penetrate it head-on. The Hellcat crews didn't try. They split up, manoeuvred through side streets, and circled behind the German behemoths. At 400 metres, firing at the King Tiger's rear armour, which was only 80mm thick, they destroyed 2 and immobilised the 3rd. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. No American casualties. The German crew of the surviving King Tiger, captured after they abandoned their immobilised vehicle, expressed disbelief. One gunner, looking at the Hellcat that had killed his companions, shook his head. "We are in the most powerful tank in the world," he said through a translator. "Yet we die to this?" He gestured at the Hellcat's thin armour, the open turret. "This is a scout car with a gun. How is this possible?" The American lieutenant, 24 years old, tired and filthy from 3 years of combat, smiled without humour. "Because we're faster than your turret," he said simply. "Speed, always speed." That single word encapsulated the Hellcats' philosophy and the reason it succeeded where heavier, better armoured vehicles failed. The Germans had built tanks to dominate through firepower and protection. The Americans had built a destroyer to kill through tempo and manoeuvre. In 1945, as the war ground toward its conclusion, it was clear which philosophy had prevailed. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Hellcat battalions, those that remained operational, parked their vehicles and began the long process of demobilization. For most crews, it couldn't come fast enough, but the vehicle's combat record spoke for itself. 526 enemy tanks and assault guns destroyed, 498 in Europe alone. A kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1, higher than any other American tank or tank destroyer. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion alone was credited with over 90 kills, the 603rd, 83. Yet the Hellcat was retired from U.S. service almost immediately after the war. Why? The answer lies in changing doctrine. The Tank Destroyer Command, which had championed the vehicle's development, was disbanded in 1946. Military planners concluded that specialized tank destroyer units were unnecessary. Future conflicts would use main battle tanks for all armoured roles. Heavy, well protected, capable of both offensive and defensive missions. The Hellcat, designed for a specific mission, ambush enemy armour and withdraw, didn't fit that doctrine. Its thin armour made it useless for frontline duty. Its limited ammunition capacity, 45 rounds, meant it couldn't sustain prolonged engagements. And its open turret, while providing excellent visibility, was seen as an unacceptable vulnerability in an age where tactical nuclear weapons were being contemplated. So, the Hellcats were mothballed, sold as surplus. A few went to Allied nations. Yugoslavia operated them until the 1990s, a testament to their mechanical reliability. Taiwan used them for coastal defense. West Germany, ironically, received several dozen for police and border patrol duties. But by 1950, the M18 Hellcat had vanished from American arsenals. Only in one place did it see American service again: Korea. The M39, a turretless variant of the Hellcat chassis, served as an armoured personnel carrier and artillery tractor, but the gun-armed version never returned to combat. The age of the tank destroyer, as a distinct type of vehicle, had ended. Still, veterans remembered. Robert Carver, the lieutenant who survived Noville, returned home to Ohio, married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke of the war. But in 1996, invited to a reunion of Hellcat veterans, he stood before his old vehicle, restored and on display at a museum. He ran his hand along the thin armour, the open turret. A younger veteran asked, "Would you do it again? Get in one of these knowing how vulnerable it was?" Carver thought for a long moment. Then he smiled. "In a heartbeat," he said. "That machine gave me a fighting chance. Against Panthers, against Tigers, against everything the Germans could throw at us. We weren't invincible, but we were fast, and fast was enough." In the history of armoured warfare, the Hellcat occupies a unique position. It was not the most powerful tank destroyer. The M36, with its 90mm gun, could kill any German tank at longer ranges. It was not the best protected. Even the M10 Wolverine had thicker armour. But it was the fastest, and in the chaotic, fluid battles of 1944 and 45, speed mattered more than planners had anticipated. The 40 seconds between detection and death, the time it took a Hellcat moving at 55 miles per hour to close from 2 miles to killing range, became a defining characteristic of late-war combat in Europe. German tank commanders learned to fear that interval. American crews learned to exploit it, and in the mathematics of survival, those 40 seconds represented the difference between victory and defeat. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, later wrote in his memoirs, "If asked to name the 3 things that contributed most to victory, I would say the atomic bomb, the the C-47 transport aircraft, and the Jeep. But he later amended that statement in a private letter to General Bruce, the father of the tank destroyer doctrine. He wrote, "I should have included the Hellcat. It proved that speed and intelligence could triumph over armor and firepower. That lesson is worth remembering. But the German perspective provides perhaps the most telling epitaph. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army against Patton in Lorraine, was interviewed after the war by American historians. They asked what surprised him most about American armor tactics. Without hesitation, he replied, "The M18. We had Panthers that could destroy it at 2 kilometers. We had Tigers that could withstand anything it could fire. Yet we lost tanks to that light destroyer at rates we never experienced against the Soviet T-34. Why? Because the Americans understood something we forgot. War is not decided by the best equipment. It is decided by the fastest decision cycle. The M18 gave American crews the initiative. Once you surrender initiative, you have lost the battle." He paused, then added, "We Germans invented blitzkrieg, lightning war, rapid maneuver, exploitation of speed. The Americans took our concept and perfected it at the tactical level. The M18 was our philosophy used against us. That is a bitter pill to swallow." The snow continued to fall that Christmas Day in Noville. By evening, the temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius. Carver and his surviving crew huddled in their Hellcat, engine running to provide heat. They had no idea if they would survive the night. German armor was regrouping. Artillery was falling intermittently on the town. Supplies were critically low, but they were still alive, still fighting. And somewhere in the darkness, the distinctive high-pitched whine of a Hellcat engine echoed as another crew repositioned for the next engagement. The sound had become familiar to both sides. To the Americans, it meant hope. To the Germans, it meant death was approaching at 55 miles per hour. And death, as German tank crews had learned the hard way, gave them exactly 40 seconds to react. The assembly line at Buick's Flint, Michigan plant ran silent on October 15, 1944. The last M18 Hellcat, vehicle number 2005-107, rolled off the production line at 1400 hours. Workers gathered to watch, some taking photographs, others simply standing in quiet reflection. For 18 months, this facility had produced the fastest tracked armoured vehicle in the world, at a rate that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Plant manager Dorothy Haas, one of thousands of women who had stepped into industrial roles during the war, placed her hand on the final Hellcat's hull. She had overseen production from the first prototype tests to this final vehicle. In a letter to her sister, preserved in the General Motors archives, she wrote, "We built 2,507 of them. Each one carried 5 men into battle. That's 12,535 souls, whose lives depended on what we built here. I pray we built them well enough." They had, but the story of those 12,535 men and the machine they trusted with their lives extends beyond simple production numbers and kill ratios. It is a story about adaptation, about the collision between industrial innovation and military necessity, and about how a vehicle designed by automobile engineers fundamentally changed the calculus of armoured warfare. Let us return to the beginning, to understand not just what the Hellcat was, but what it represented. In 1941, American military doctrine regarding tanks was hopelessly outdated. The prevailing theory, inherited from World War I, held that tanks existed primarily to support infantry assaults. They would break through entrenched positions, allowing foot soldiers to exploit the breach. Tank versus tank combat was considered a specialized scenario, not the primary mission. This thinking had dominated U.S. armor development for 2 decades. Then came Poland, France, the Soviet Union. German panzer divisions, operating independently of infantry, smashed through defensive lines and encircled entire armies before they could react. The speed of the German advance shocked military observers worldwide. In France, the Wehrmacht covered distances in days that World War I armies had required months to traverse. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a conceptual revolution. The US Army, watching from across the Atlantic, recognized that its armor doctrine was obsolete, but the solution was not obvious. Should America build heavier tanks to match German panzers in direct combat? Should it focus on defensive anti-tank weapons to blunt armored assaults, or should it attempt something different entirely? General Andrew Bruce proposed a radical answer. Don't try to match German armor piece for piece. Instead, create specialized tank destroyer units that could respond rapidly to panzer breakthroughs, destroy enemy armor through superior mobility and positioning, then withdraw before the enemy could counterattack. The concept was borrowed from naval warfare. Destroyers, smaller and faster than battleships, using speed and maneuverability to compensate for lighter armor. The analogy was imperfect, but the philosophy was sound. At least, that's what Bruce believed. Many senior officers disagreed vehemently. They argued that specialized tank destroyer units would be vulnerable, under-armored, and unable to hold ground once enemy armor was destroyed. The debate raged through 1942 and into 1943, even as the first Hellcat prototypes were being tested. What settled the argument wasn't rhetoric, it was mathematics. Engineers at Buick calculated that a vehicle weighing 20 tons, powered by a 400 horsepower engine, could theoretically reach speeds of 60 miles per hour on level ground. At that speed, it could reposition faster than any existing tank could traverse its turret. If equipped with a gun powerful enough to penetrate German armor from the side or rear, it could strike and withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. The key was accepting minimal armor as a trade-off for maximum mobility. The military establishment resisted this logic. Thin armor meant higher casualties. How could you justify sending men into battle in a vehicle that couldn't withstand enemy fire? But Bruce countered with a different question. How many men would die in heavily armored tanks that arrived too late to the battle, or sat immobile while faster enemy units outmaneuvered them? The question was never satisfactorily answered. Instead, the Hellcat was approved for production as an experiment. If it succeeded, the doctrine would be validated. If it failed, lessons would be learned, and the design abandoned. The men who would crew it were, in essence, test subjects for a theory of warfare. This reality was not lost on the crews themselves. Sergeant William Hayes, a gunner in the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, wrote in his diary on July 28, 1944, shortly before his first combat mission. We arrived in France yesterday, saw our Hellcats for the first time up close, climbed inside. The armor is a joke. I can see daylight through the turret gaps. Our lieutenant says speed is our armor. I say speed won't stop an 88mm shell. But orders are orders. Tomorrow we head to the front. Hayes survived the war. His Hellcat did not. He went through 3 different vehicles, each one destroyed in combat. The first was knocked out near Saint-Lô by a Panther's long-range shot that penetrated the hull and killed the driver. Hayes and the rest of the crew bailed out. The second Hellcat was destroyed by a Panzerfaust, a German handheld anti-tank weapon, during street fighting in Metz. Again, Hayes survived, though the loader lost his left arm. The third Hellcat lasted until February of 1945, when it struck a mine near the Siegfried Line. Hayes was thrown clear by the explosion. The vehicle commander was not. Yet, despite these losses, Hayes remained a believer in the Hellcat's design. In a 1987 interview, he explained, "I lost 3 tanks, but I'm alive. My friends who crewed Shermans and M10s, a lot of them didn't make it. The Hellcat gave us options. We could engage or withdraw. We could flank or ambush. The Germans, in their heavy tanks, they had to stand and fight. We didn't. That flexibility saved my life 3 times over." This sentiment was common among Hellcat veterans. They understood the vehicle's vulnerabilities intimately, but they also recognized that its speed provided a form of survivability that armor alone could not guarantee. The key was proper employment. Use the Hellcat as a frontal assault vehicle, and it died quickly. Use it as a mobile ambush platform, and it dominated. The challenge was ensuring that commanders understood this distinction. Not all did. Some officers, accustomed to conventional armor tactics, deployed Hellcats in static defensive positions or sent them forward in unsupported attacks. The results were predictably disastrous. A Hellcat sitting still was a target. A Hellcat advancing without reconnaissance was suicide. After-action reports from 1944 reveal a learning curve. Early engagements saw higher Hellcat losses as crews and commanders figured out optimal tactics. By September, during the battles at Arracourt, the doctrine had crystallized. By December at the Bulge, it was second nature. The evolution took months and cost lives, but it resulted in a tactical system that German commanders found nearly impossible to counter. Consider the engagement at WWII on September 22, 1944. Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion, equipped with Shermans, was pinned down by Panthers from the 11th Panzer Division. The German tanks held a ridgeline with excellent fields of fire. Any American attempt to advance directly was met with devastating long-range fire. The Shermans' 75mm guns couldn't penetrate Panther armor beyond 500 meters. The Panthers could kill Shermans at 1,500 meters. Stalemate. Until the Hellcats arrived, Lieutenant Paul Becker, commanding a platoon from the 704th, assessed the situation. Frontal assault was impossible, but the Panthers, confident in their position, had focused their attention on the direct approach. Their flanks were screened by infantry, but not heavily. Becker split his platoon. 2 Hellcats would swing wide left, using a stream bed for concealment. 2 would go right, behind a wood line. Both groups would advance at maximum speed to positions approximately 800 meters from the Panthers' flanks. The maneuver took 17 minutes. The Hellcats, moving cross-country at 40 miles per hour, covered 3 miles of rough terrain, crossed the stream bed and wood line, and achieved firing positions before the German infantry screen could react. At Becker's signal, all 4 Hellcats opened fire, simultaneously. 8 Panthers were engaged at once, 4 from each side. The Germans, expecting threats from the front, had their turrets pointed the wrong direction. By the time they began to traverse, 3 Panthers were burning. The survivors attempted to reposition, turning their hulls to bring guns to bear, but this exposed their thinner side armor to the Shermans in front, who immediately opened fire. Caught between threats from 2 directions, the German position collapsed. 11 Panthers destroyed or abandoned in 20 minutes. 1 Hellcat damaged by infantry anti-tank fire, but able to withdraw under its own power. No American tanks lost. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, witnessed the engagement. His after-action report stated, "The M18 Hellcat has proven its worth beyond question. When employed properly, utilizing terrain and speed, it can defeat superior enemy armor through tactical maneuver." Recommend expanded a deployment and training emphasis on combined arms coordination. This battle, and dozens like it, validated the Hellcat's design philosophy, but it also highlighted something that specifications and test reports could never capture. The vehicle required skilled, aggressive crews willing to take calculated risks. A timid commander in a Hellcat was worse than useless. An aggressive commander with good tactical sense was a force multiplier beyond anything the Germans could counter with equipment alone. The U.S. Army recognized this and adjusted its training accordingly. Tank Destroyer School at Fort Hood, Texas, emphasized speed, maneuver, and independent decision-making. Crews learned to think like cavalrymen, not like tank soldiers. They studied terrain reading, covered approaches, and rapid displacement. Gunnery training focused on quick target acquisition and first-round hits, because a Hellcat rarely got a second chance. By contrast, German tank training in 1944 emphasized durability and sustained combat. Panther and Tiger crews learned to use their armor and firepower to dominate battlefields through superior equipment. This made sense given their vehicles' capabilities, but it also created a mindset that struggled to adapt when facing opponents who refused to fight the battle the Germans expected. Captured German training manuals from late 1944 show attempts to develop counter-tactics. One document, distributed to Panther battalions in November, recommended, when encountering American M18 tank destroyers, immediately adopt defensive posture. Position hull to maximize frontal armor. Maintain turret traverse toward the most likely threat axis. Deploy infantry screen at 300 meters to detect flanking attempts. Do not pursue unless infantry support is available. These were reasonable recommendations, but they revealed the problem. The Hellcat had forced German armor onto the defensive. Panthers and Tigers, designed to spearhead attacks, were now being advised to adopt defensive tactics when facing a vehicle they outgunned and out-armored. The psychological shift was profound. German crews, once confident in their equipment superiority, now hesitated. Hesitation in combat is often fatal. Oberst Gustav Weber, commanding a Panther battalion that fought against the 4th Armoured Division in Lorraine, was captured in January of 1945. During interrogation, he provided insight into German thinking. We were told the American M18 could not withstand hits from our guns. This was true. We were told its 76mm gun could not penetrate our frontal armor. This was also true. But what we were not told, what no one understood until we faced it, was that the M18 did not fight the battle we prepared for. It fought a different battle entirely, one where our advantages meant nothing because we could not bring them to bear. This statement encapsulates the Hellcat's strategic impact. It didn't just destroy German tanks, it disrupted German tactical doctrine. Panzer commanders, trained to execute aggressive maneuvers, found themselves constrained by the threat of ambush. They advanced more slowly. They required more reconnaissance. They positioned support units defensively. All of this reduced the tempo of German operations, which in turn allowed Allied forces to maintain initiative. The economic dimension deserves examination as well. A Panther tank cost approximately 117,000 Reichsmarks to produce, equivalent to roughly 55,000 US dollars at 1944 exchange rates. A Tiger cost 250,000 Reichsmarks. These vehicles represented enormous investments in materials, labor, and industrial capacity. Germany, by 1944, was desperately short of all three. The Hellcat cost approximately $50,000 to produce, cheaper than a Sherman, which ran about 60,000, and significantly cheaper than German heavy armor. Moreover, Buick could produce Hellcats faster than German factories could produce Panthers. The Flint plant, at peak production, turned out 250 Hellcats per month. All German tank production combined barely exceeded 300 vehicles monthly by late 1944. This meant that even in a direct exchange, one Hellcat for one Panther, the Allies came out ahead economically. But the actual exchange ratio at Arracourt was 39 German tanks for 4 Hellcats lost. At the Bulge, 27-6. The economic calculation was devastating for Germany. They were losing vehicles worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks to vehicles costing a fraction as much. And they couldn't replace them fast enough. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, understood this. In a memo to Hitler dated November 5, 1944, he wrote, "Our losses in armor exceed production capacity. We face an enemy who can replace vehicles faster than we can destroy them. Our technical superiority in individual tank quality is negated by their quantitative and tactical advantages. Recommend immediate increase in production or reconsideration of strategic objectives." Hitler ignored the recommendation. Germany continued building Tigers and Panthers, magnificent machines that consumed resources at unsustainable rates, while American factories churned out Shermans, Hellcats, and other vehicles in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, failed in part because of logistics. The Panzers ran out of fuel. Meanwhile, American tank destroyers, including Hellcats, were supplied so efficiently that they never faced ammunition shortages. This logistical dimension is often overlooked when discussing the Hellcat. Its mechanical simplicity meant easier maintenance. Its lighter weight meant easier transport. Its standardized parts meant faster repairs. A Hellcat with a damaged engine could be back in action within 8 hours. A Panther with similar damage might require days or weeks, assuming parts were available. Technical Sergeant Arnold Mueller, a maintenance chief with the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, kept detailed logs of repair times. His records show that the average turnaround for battle-damaged Hellcats was 12 hours from arrival at the maintenance depot to return to service. For comparison, Sherman tanks averaged 22 hours. The Hellcat's design, with its accessible engine and modular components, made it a mechanic's dream. Mueller wrote in a December 1944 report, "The M18 is the easiest armoured vehicle I have ever worked on. The right radial engine can be pulled and replaced in 4 hours by a trained crew. Transmission access is straightforward. Track maintenance is simple. If we had to work on Tigers or Panthers with this level of design intelligence, the war would be over already." This practical engineering excellence reflected Buick's automotive background. Car companies understood that vehicles needed to be serviceable by mechanics with basic tools and training. Military equipment, by contrast, often prioritized performance over maintainability. The Hellcat bridged this gap, delivering high performance without sacrificing serviceability. Yet for all its successes, the Hellcat had limitations that combat revealed starkly. The open turret, while providing excellent visibility, meant crews were exposed to elements and indirect fire. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, one of the coldest on record, Hellcat crews suffered from exposure-related injuries at rates higher than enclosed turret vehicles. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia killed at least 15 crew members who might have survived in warmer conditions. The thin armour, while accepted as a design trade-off, still resulted in high casualty rates when vehicles were hit. Medical reports indicate that Hellcat crew members struck by enemy fire had lower survival rates than Sherman crews, simply because the thinner armour allowed more complete penetration and more severe internal effects. One Army Medical Corps study concluded, when an M18 is struck by enemy anti-tank fire, crew survivability is approximately 35%. For M4 Shermans, the figure is 58%. These statistics troubled some commanders. General Omar Bradley, despite recognizing the Hellcat's tactical value, expressed reservations in his memoirs. The M18 achieved remarkable results, but at a human cost that concerns me. We asked young men to ride into battle in vehicles we knew could not protect them from direct hits. That they performed so well is a testament to their courage, not to the wisdom of our decisions. This moral dimension, the ethics of deploying underprotected vehicles, remains debated among military historians. Some argue the Hellcat's speed and maneuverability actually reduced casualties by allowing crews to avoid situations where heavier armour would be necessary. Others contend that better armoured tank destroyers, like the M36, should have been prioritised earlier. The crews themselves had varied opinions. Private First Class David Chen, a driver in the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, felt the design was justified. "I'd rather be fast than armoured. Armour just means you survive the first hit. Speed means they don't hit you at all. I'll take my chances with speed." Conversely, Corporal James Patton, whose Hellcat was destroyed with heavy crew casualties, wrote bitterly, "They sent us out in tin cans and called it doctrine. We weren't tank destroyers. We were sacrificial pawns." Both perspectives contain truth. The Hellcat was a calculated risk, trading protection for capability. Whether that trade-off was morally justified depends on how one weighs individual crew, survivability against overall unit effectiveness and strategic impact. What is beyond dispute is that Hellcat crews developed an extraordinary esprit de corps. They knew they crewed vehicles that were different, that required different tactics, that inspired both respect and skepticism from other armoured units. This created a sense of identity. Hellcat battalions took pride in their speed, their kill ratios, their reputation as the fastest destroyers in Europe. Unit patches reflected this pride. The 704th adopted an emblem showing a cat in mid-leap, claws extended. The motto beneath read, First shot, fast shot. The 705th used a similar design with the phrase, "Speed kills." These weren't official army insignia. They were created by the crews themselves, expressions of their belief in the machine they operated and the doctrine they embodied. After the war, when the Hellcat was retired from U.S. service, many veterans mourned its passing, not because they wanted to return to combat, but because the vehicle represented something meaningful. It symbolized American industrial ingenuity, practical problem-solving, and the idea that cleverness could triumph over brute force. In 1993, the U.S. Army held a ceremony at Fort Hood marking the 50th anniversary of the Hellcats' first combat deployment. Veterans from a dozen battalions attended. A restored M18 was displayed, its paint gleaming, its engine silent. General retired John Thompson, who had commanded a Hellcat as a young lieutenant, gave the keynote speech. His words capture what the vehicle meant to those who fought in it. We were young men, most of us barely out of our teens, sent to fight the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. They had Tigers, Panthers, equipment that was, by any technical measure, superior to ours. But we had something they didn't. We had speed. We had flexibility. We had the ability to fight our fight, not theirs. The Hellcat gave us that. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't invincible. But it was enough. And for those of us who made it home, that machine, that beautiful, fragile, impossibly fast machine, is why we're standing here today. The audience, many of them in their 70s and 80s, stood and applauded. Some wept. The Hellcat, for all its technical specifications and combat statistics, had become something more than a weapon. It was a memory of youth, of survival, of a time when speed and courage were the difference between life and death. In the final analysis, the M18 Hellcat represents a unique moment in military history. It was conceived in desperation, designed by car engineers, built by factory workers who had never seen combat, and crewed by young men asked to trust their lives to 13 millimeters of armor and 400 horsepower. That it succeeded as well as it did is remarkable. That it became legendary is testament to the crews who made it work. The 40 seconds, between detection and death, the mathematical reality that defined the Hellcat's tactical employment, became emblematic of a broader truth. In warfare, time is often more valuable than armor. Speed is often more decisive than firepower. And sometimes, the fastest coffin in Europe, as that young engineer called it, is exactly what victory requires. The last Hellcat in American military service was retired in 1953. It sits now in a museum in Pennsylvania, surrounded by plaques describing its specifications and combat record. 526 kills, 2.4-to-1 ratio, fastest tracked vehicle of World War II. The numbers tell part of the story. But they don't tell the whole story. They don't capture the sound of that engine, high-pitched and urgent, that made German tank crews reach for their periscopes in alarm. They don't convey the split-second decisions made by young commanders who knew that staying still meant death. They don't explain how something so vulnerable became so deadly. That explanation requires understanding not just the machine, but the men who crewed it, the doctrine that employed it, and the enemy that learned to fear it. In 40 seconds, travelling at 55 miles per hour, the Hellcat closed from 2 miles to killing range. In those 40 seconds, wars were decided. In those 40 seconds, the future of armoured warfare was written. And in the memories of the men who survived, those 40 seconds remain frozen. A moment of absolute clarity when speed was armour, mobility was life, and a thin-skinned destroyer built by Buick proved faster than death itself.